Thank you, Rabbi Zarum. I want to thank the congregation of Western Marble Arch, Rabbi Daniel, Rabbanit, Ilana Epstein, for welcoming us. And I want to thank Rabbi Dr. Zarum, my dear friend and colleague, for giving me this opportunity to be able to share some words with you, thoughts with you, about our great Rav, Zatzal, on the occasion of his first, as we would say, as Faradim would say, his Nahala, or his Yahrzeit. I'll share a personal story with you to open that I had with the Rav. It was 2013. I had just been elected as the senior rabbi of the S&P, and I was coming in and out. I hadn't yet moved to London. I was living in New York. I was coming in and out every month, not only to get to know my new community, but to get to know British Jewry. And so I met all different people every time that I was here. And one of the early visits, I had the great honor and opportunity to meet Rabbi Sachs at Hamilton Terrace. I came to the door at Hamilton Terrace, and he brought me in, and I sat, and we were speaking. And he said to me, he said, "You know, Rabbi Dweck," and this was when he was still in office, before he had left office. He said, "You know, Rabbi Dweck, you and I are the ecclesiastical authorities to the Board of Deputies." I said, "Oh, what does that mean?" He said, "I have no idea." That was probably the only time I have ever heard Rabbi Sachs say, "I have no idea." He always had the idea. Not only did he have the idea, but he had many ideas that we all know. And the reason we're here tonight, here in person and listening online, is because his ideas penetrated our souls, sat well in our hearts, filled our minds. One of the projects that the great Rav engaged in was a weekly offering of thought, of ideas on the parasha. Every week, the Jewish people are on the same page. When you think about that, it's something that we tend to take for granted. But Jews all over the world, with the reading of the Torah, are on the same page, literally. And that means that the stories that we read are collectively in our national hearts and minds. And that is fertile ground in the thinking of the Jewish people. And Rabbi Sachs said, there, in that place, on that page, I want to speak to Am Yisrael. And so, covenant and conversation. And that's how, in all honesty, I'm an American kid, grew up in Los Angeles, was living in New York. That's how I came to know him. And you know what? Outside of this island, that's how pretty much everyone got to know him. Covenant and conversation was his signature. It was in those pages every week that Rabbi Sachs told us who he was. And at the same time, he told us who we were. And we loved hearing it. And I want to think with you for a moment on what covenant and conversation was and is for us. Because its prominence, its power, its fame is something that must not be underestimated. We have to understand it. The Nahala, the Yahrzeit of the Rav, will always be intertwined with the story of Avraham Avinu. We will always be on that page when we remember him and mark his great life. And being a rabbi, I will offer that is not a fluke. The Rambam, Rabbi Moshe Bar Maimon, he teaches us that the ultimate goal, that everything that we do in our lives is ultimately for one purpose, and that is to know God. And that is built on the founding father of our nation, and that is Abraham. And what we know about Abraham, as the Rambam writes at the opening of Hilchot Avodah Zarah, is that Abraham Avinu discovered God. He had no teacher. Abraham Avinu discovered God. He was immersed in everything that told him otherwise. He discovered God not by studying a Torah. As a matter of fact, if you take a close look, never once does God say anything about a Torah to Abraham Avinu. But that's for another sermon. Abraham discovered God one way. And that, of course, was by looking at the world that God made. He discovered God by looking at his deeds, his artwork, his creativity, his expressions. What we would simply call his ways. And we think sometimes that because we do, thankfully, have a Torah now, and as we say every Ma'ariv, every Arvit, Kihem hayenu ve'orech yamenu, they are our very life, the words of the Torah. The length of our days, they are everything to us, the words of our Torah. And we think sometimes that because we have it, we no longer have to look at the world, discover God, come to know him the way our forefather Abraham did. And that, my friends, is a mistake. We never leave what Abraham Avinu taught us or the manner in which he lived behind. As Isaiah says, always look, habitu el bur mahsabtem. Look at the quarry you are hewn from. Habitu el Abraham avichem. Look at Abraham, your father. He is where you find your compass. He is where you find your direction. And that means that we must always look for God. We must always find our spirituality in his world. Now that we have a Torah, we must read them in tandem. The author of the Torah is the author of the world. There are no contradictions. The great Rav put that out in Covenant and Conversation every single week. And think about the first time you read it. I wonder if you can. Because I remember the first time I saw it. It was printed pages in a synagogue like this, but in Brooklyn. Same layout, more or less. Sitting on the table as we walked in. And then I looked up, and everyone had one. And I thought, what is this? I was about 16 years old, 17 years old. And remember, although we're dating things, it wasn't easy to share words. Rabbi Sachs was chief rabbi for 22 years. It was only towards the end that he could actually share his words that way. Send what he had written easily across the ocean. And that changed people's lives. Because you know what it meant to read Covenant and Conversation? It meant that you were reading Torah, first of all, in a deep, examined, closely read lens. Because Rabbi Sachs didn't just write an idea on the parasha. Rabbi Sachs read the parasha closely. And if you read Covenant and Conversation, you will see that he usually points out an issue in the text. There's something peculiar in the story. More often than not, you read it and think, I never noticed that. And so you read the Torah with dignity, with scholarship, with depth, but it didn't stop there. Then he brought the idea that he highlighted in the Torah and he said, now let's bring that into our everyday. Let's look at how we live this. And if that wasn't enough, which already got me, and it got you, be honest. Because you read depth of Torah and you read relevance of Torah in your life. Every single week. And it didn't stop there. Because when he spoke about your life, he didn't speak about it superficially, did he? When he spoke about your experience, he didn't speak about it superficially, did he? No. He went right in, drilled in, and he brought his books, as Rabbi Zarum was referencing. He had a lot of them. I saw firsthand. There wasn't a wall in his home, practically. And he brought his books. And he brought his mind and his knowledge and his readings and his thought. And he took your Torah and gave it to you. And he took your life and put it together and gave it to you. And then he dug in and he said, let's go deep into the substance. And you know what you would think? If I were to tell you, so I've got something for you to read that's like this, like I just described, you would say, well, how many pages is it? Are there big words? Am I going to have to shut everybody out of the room and sit here? No. You could read it, sitting in synagogue, and you will understand it. And how brilliant is that? That it doesn't just take from the lofty thought and the depth of understanding and the breadth of our Torah. It brings it into a servable, digestible, acceptable, understandable framework. Every single week. And I asked him at another time, I was with him, and I said, Rav, Covenant and Conversation, how do you do that? He said, well, I write a lot of them and I put them in the freezer. That, my friends, to say that its greatness is a given. More importantly, the question is, what did it do to us? What does it do for us? I'll tell you what it did and what it does. It tells me, the Rav taught us that our Torah is relevant. It is cutting edge. It is deep. And it is broad. And it is meaningful now, today, as meaningful as it was 3,000 years ago. And I'm going to show you how. And if you ask me, that is his greatest legacy. Not to diminish anything else that he did in his life. But if you ask me, that is his greatest legacy. Because at the end of the day, Torah is as meaningful as it is to the Jewish people. And how it fills our lives. And what it means to us. He reminded us what it means to live like Avraham Avinu now. He gave us a taste of what it was for Avraham to study and understand the world and through it see God. And for us, what it means is, on whatever level, we must continue that. If we are teaching, then we have to teach that way. If we are learning, then we should demand to learn that way. If we are supporting, then we should seek to support that. Because it's only in that framework, it is only in that formula, it is only in that presentation that our lives are vivid and relevant and now alive. And so, as the Gemara says, Yaakov lo met. Yaakov never died. And the Gemara says, V'chisavdu safdayeh, hantu hantayeh. Did we not see that eulogies were given? The body was embalmed, if we're talking about Yaakov Avinu. And the Gemara answers very simply, well, fine. But what he taught lives on forever. And it is alive and vivid. Covenant and conversation. That is where the soul of the Rav's writing, his thought, and his contribution to his nation lives forever. Thank you.
To thank our speaker, Rabbi Dweck, for his magnificent words in honor of Rabbi Sachs, and for focusing so beautifully on covenant and conversation, which I know absolutely enriches my home every week. And please God, it should live on and enrich the homes of countless families around the world for many, many years to come. So thank you so much for those beautiful words. And Rabbi Dweck, it's really an honor to have you as our Vice President, as it was an honor to have Rabbi Sachs as our president for so many years after so much involvement in many roles within LSJS and Jews College before. And really, Rabbi Dweck, it is a privilege of my role to be surrounded by people who offer so much wisdom, and I learn from you and from the teachers that we have at LSJS, so thank you ever so much for that. And I now call on our host this evening, Rabbi Epstein, another great Talmud of Rabbi Sachs, who's going to address us this evening, focusing on his thoughts and Rabbi Sachs' thoughts on becoming a good citizen. And we thank you for your welcome into this magnificent shul, for having us this evening.